Everyone, happy Gav is Gone Day, and welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's Deputy Political Editor, Ben Glaze. Good morning, Ben.
Morning.
Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to march on Parliament and make a noise. So, what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on Matt Hancock entering the celebrity jungle, saying that he wants people to see the real me, which, having spoken to some who know the real him already, may be a real act of overconfidence on his part. But we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? But today in Westminster, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is on the ropes because not only does he have the mother of all financial headaches, a minister has just had to resign and another one's looking very shaky. And it's been perhaps, 2 weeks since the last resignations, just ages in the current climate. It seems like a long time since we had a crisis. Now, Ben, take us through this. So Gavin Williamson was officially Minister without portfolio, but unofficially he was sort of chief whip in charge of party discipline. So if I've got this right, he was basically chief bully in charge of bullying people. And he's been found to have bullied them so badly that he can no longer bully them effectively. So he's had to go and they'll get another bully instead. Have I got that right?
I think we should stress that they're allegations and that Sir Gavin start with. So what's happened is he was chief whip back a few years ago, first of all, under Theresa May. Now, the chief whip is responsible for discipline, enforcing discipline, but also for welfare. Now, the role was obviously made famous in House of Cards, the original British version. The character Francis Urquhart became, I think, Frank Underwood in the American version. And Gavin Williamson seems to have taken it all a bit literally, like some of the way he behaved. He apparently wrote a cheque for one MP who was experiencing financial difficulties, and when he gave it to the deputy chief whip to pass on to this unfortunate MP, said, "Make sure he knows I own him now." He was very Machiavellian, dark arts. Everyone knew how Gavin Williamson behaved. He actually kept a literal whip on his desk, and he also had this tarantula called Cronus, which apparently he would use to intimidate people. He was a bit of a weird character, but he survived various scandals, through various governments. So, of course, he was sacked as Defence Secretary by Theresa May because he allegedly leaked from the National Security Council, which is a big no-no. You should not leak from the NSC. He denied that, but he still got sacked. Came back under Boris Johnson's Education Secretary, made complete haulits of the exam system during coronavirus, sacked again for incompetence this time. Brought back once more because he was quite influential in Rishi Sunak's leadership campaign. You remember that's the one that Rishi Sunak lost to Liz Truss, who proved such a success that she had to go 7 weeks later. And then Rishi Sunak becomes Prime Minister after all and brings Sir Gavin back into government as a Cabinet Office Minister without portfolio. So yeah, he was working behind the scenes. It was only actually yesterday we got a full breakdown of what his exact job, what his exact role would entail. And a few hours after that, he has to resign because of these messages that he'd been found to send to the current, or the Liz Truss's chief whip, and then various revelations about his behaviour when he was Secretary of State for Defence, and basically the floodgates were open. So Gavin Williamson realised the writing was on the wall and resigned to the Prime Minister yesterday evening.
The thing is that, I mean, you know, he's had the writing on the wall and seen what's happened. He's been sacked not for the same thing repeatedly, but for 3 different things he's managed to get wrong, or allegedly wrong. But the issue is really, isn't it, how much Rishi Sunak knew? Because apparently he was aware there were complaints against him. Everyone in Westminster and Larry the cat knew that Gavin Williamson operated like this and thought he was like Francis Urquhart, even though he's a former fireplace salesman. And it was hardly a surprise. The question really was why Rishi ever appointed him in the first place, wasn't it?
That's right. I mean, basically, Gavin Williamson's always sort of fancied himself as this backroom operator, as the chief whip would, and sort of made himself this caricature and has tried to make himself indispensable to various prime ministers. His thing was he would see who was going to become leader and then get close to them and convince them in some sort of like, you know, confidence trickster from Faulty Towers. He would do that. He would convince these leaders in waiting that they needed him, and so it proved because they all took him into government. And Rishi Sunak, you know, the supposed grown-up in the room, relied on him, or thought he needed to rely on him, just as much as both David Cameron did, because back in the day, he was David Cameron's parliamentary private secretary, which is, you know, the first rung on the ministerial ladder, and the bag carrier around Parliament. But he got close to people, and managed to convince them that he was indispensable to them. And now he has been dispensed with, and we'll see quite how indispensable he was.
Well, probably most of us know someone in an office or maybe a newsroom that has done things like that before and acted in that way to get promoted. Now, Misha says, are we shocked, really? Isn't this level of psychopathy pretty much required for entrance into the Tory party? I think it's required for entrance into politics to some extent, although there are lots of politicians who aren't lunatics. But like I said, we do see it everywhere. But one thing I want to say, Ben, I was came home from through London Bridge yesterday, right? And as I was standing on the platform, there was an announcement on the tannoy, just a standard regular sort of taped thing they put out regularly that you will hear at lots of places, that says, you know, we will not tolerate abuse or bullying of our staff. Any such behaviour will, you know, you'll be ejected from the station, kind of thing. I've seen notices about that at the vets. All right. It's a bit leery down here sometimes. But if it's not allowed at the train station, then how come David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak have all been fine employing somebody who allegedly operates in that manner? Why didn't someone stop him?
It's the usual thing about different rules apply at Westminster, isn't it? You know, we've seen various sleazy behaviour, bullying allegations. It just seems to be that this sort of thing is accepted in Westminster, and it's becoming less acceptable as the fact that he's now gone demonstrates. But there's been 2 referrals about Sir Gavin's behaviour to the Independent Grievance and Complaints Service in Parliament, the IGCS, one by Wendy Morton, the Chief Whip, under Liz Truss, for text messages he sent her about him being basically upset that he wasn't invited to the Queen's funeral, and also from a former civil servant at the Ministry of Defence who Sir Gavin told, we are led to believe, told slit your throat and jump out of the window. It's not very nice behaviour, even in Westminster. So that parliamentary process, that investigation will go on, even though Sir Gavin is no longer a minister. And at its most, it could, you know, I think it can recommend suspensions and censure and things like that. So this definitely isn't the end of the matter, because those investigations, I mean, in his resignation letter, Williamson actually said that he's stepping down so he can focus on dealing with those investigations, which is, you know, everyone's excuse to make.
Am I right in thinking, Ben, what happened to the internal investigation into Chris Pincher's alleged handiness? Is that still going on as well?
I believe that's still going on, yeah.
Yeah, they don't go quickly, these things. In fact, they tend to perhaps end when someone's not looking at them anymore. Now, Mike says, I bet Matt's fuming. Matt Hancock is fuming now, knowing there's suddenly a spare cabinet seat, even without portfolio. He'll be screaming, I'm a celebrity, get me into the cabinet. To be fair, Mike, that's probably exactly what his plan is for the next few years. It worked for Nadine Dorries, let's face it. Batman says, good morning, Foxy. Hello, Batman. Time for another Prime Minister. Not yet. Let's let Rishi do all the bad, horrible stuff and then have a general election in early next year. And at least the next Prime Minister, whoever it is, won't have to deal with some of all the crud that I think Rishi Sunak's going to have heaped upon him and all the opprobrium. Now, keep asking us your questions. What do you think about Gavin Williamson going? What do you think about him being in government in the first place? Have you worked with someone a bit like Gavin? I certainly have. But to another issue on Rishi's desk, which is that of on the other side of things, we're going to talk about Home Secretary Suella Braverman. Now, she's facing repeated accusations of breaking the law, misleading Parliament, creating unofficial detention centres at Manston. And it all sort of generally calls into question, along with Gavin's story, the judgment of this third Prime Minister we've had in about as many months, all of whom, of course, went because their judgment was called into question. Now, Rishi said when he entered Downing Street, Ben, it would be a government of integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. When's that going to start, do you think?
Yeah, it's not looking great, is it, for the Prime Minister's judgment, both with Suella Braverman and Sir Gavin Williamson. And I think at Prime Minister's questions at noon today, we can expect Sir Keir Starmer to really push the Prime Minister on that. Like, he will tie all of these issues, reappointing Suella Braverman 6 days after she forced to resign because of breaching a ministerial code, and now bringing in Gavin Williamson when he knew there was an investigation against him, or a complaint against him rather, over bullying allegations. And yet still Rishi Sunak decided to appoint them both. And the key for Labour is pinning it on him, because it's all very well, one minister resigning, another basically being on borrowed time, as Suella Braverman is. But they need to tie it to the Prime Minister, because he's the one that people recognise. He's the key figure in all this. So it's his judgment that will be under question. So expect basically the Labour leader and lots of opposition MPs more generally to really give him a go about this for about half an hour this afternoon in the Commons over the dispatch boxes, because I think that's what Labour really want to push home, is judgment. Because especially when Rishi Sunak's supposed to come in as this, mature, responsible politician who's going to be the grown-up that takes over from Boris Johnson, takes over from Liz Truss, sanity restored. And yet here he is being criticised for 2 appointments that he made on his very first day in Downing Street.
Exactly. It's not something you can really avoid. And one of the other things that's going to be happening at Prime Minister's questions later on is hopefully lots of MPs wearing this, which is the missing medal. Now, this is to another issue on Rishi's desk, which is that of a mere meagre medal for Britain's nuclear test veterans. Now, on Monday on this show, we discussed how a secretive medal committee had ruled against them getting a medal for the 4th time, having previously said that there was no risk or rigour demonstrated to their service at nuclear weapons test. Now, they have kicked it upstairs to a slightly bigger committee on which Rishi Sunak and the monarch have their own representatives. And it is now, therefore, up to Rishi. He has the power, and he's the last person in Britain who can do it, to seek an audience with the king and request that there be a medal. And for that main committee, therefore, to be told to find there needs to be one. There is a precedent for that, and it is set down in the rules that Rishi can do it. Yesterday, in Parliament Square, the veterans and their families marched to demand that Rishi sort it out. And we've got some video of exactly what happened. Roll tape. Now, here we are. This is the gathering outside in the lashing rain. We had lots of MPs there with us. We had Rebecca Long-Bailey from Salford talking there to Archie, who's an HMS Diana veteran who's had to sail through fallout. We marched along Whitehall, which is the ancient right of access that everyone has in the country, and we paid our respects at the cenotaph. We laid a wreath by the barriers there, and again outside Downing Street. And then when we got to the Ministry of Defence, this happened. Some police turned up, and as you'll see, the lady there who was questioning us had her hand on her weapon the entire time. Now, all government buildings are guarded by armed police, which is absolutely fair enough, Ben. When we went to Downing Street and laid our wreath, the police stayed in their little hut because they could see there was some old men and some people in wheelchairs, and they let us do what we wanted to do. And when we walked away, they very quietly and very kindly took the wreath that we left by the gates of Downing Street and put it up against the cenotaph behind the barriers where we hadn't been able to get, where it is resting today, with black and yellow flowers to illustrate the black of the cloud and the yellow of the fireball. Now, when we went to MOD, the armed police turned up and the mood changed entirely. It was much more intimidating. Like I said, the lady who was demanding to speak to organisers had her hand on her weapon the entire time. We got these great big 6'4" blokes sort of being quite menacing. There's a couple there in the background of the MOD lobby that came out as they were stood on the steps, these 4 old gentlemen. And we had a minute's silence there, and we were made to feel extremely unwelcome. Now, Steve, who was there and came in his wheelchair, said, yesterday was quite a day. The chance to remember my dad at the cenotaph was a very special moment for my mum and myself. And unfortunately, when they went on to the Ministry of Defence, they were pretty much told to hurry up and move out of the way. Not quite ejected, but really not accepted or given the respect they deserved. Now, Ben, if all of Whitehall is guarded by armed police, you have them at Parliament, you deal with them every day. What's your experience of policing in Whitehall as a correspondent who works down there? Is this normal behaviour or not?
So it's different because obviously we do deal with them every day and we do see them. And, when I tell my friends back home, if they've seen an armed policeman in town or something, it's a big deal to them. And it's not a big deal for me. I get off the tube, they're there at Westminster, go through the gates at Westminster, they're everywhere. And, for very good reasons, as was illustrated with the attack on Westminster back in March 2017. But obviously, a relatively small protest, peaceful protest, you wouldn't expect armed police to be involved in that. Now, I should say as well, obviously, there are heightened tensions at the moment in Parliament, in and around Westminster and Whitehall, because we have got Remembrance Sunday coming up. There are crash barriers around the cenotaph, and there are regular checks being made because obviously the high-profile nature of both the Armistice Day memorials that will take place tomorrow and then Remembrance Sunday itself. They're regularly checking the drains. There are armed police. And the other thing, last week, I believe it was, when I was on my way into Downing Street for the regular daily briefing that we get as lobby correspondents, there was a Just Stop Oil protest just right in front of the cenotaph, and there was, a lot of police came and started trying to unglue them from the road and pick them up. So there is heavy security. I haven't seen a situation where armed police have sort of confronted a small peaceful protest like that before. So yeah, I was quite surprised to see those images and that footage that you just played there.
Yeah, it was a noisy protest, but it was respectful. And like I said, I think part of the reason perhaps is that the cenotaph is directly opposite the gates of Downing Street. So when we marched there first and we laid our wreaths, and the veterans sort of lined up and they stepped forward, they laid their wreath, they saluted, as you saw Brian do there. There were some families who, laid a wreath on behalf of their fathers and took a sort of emotional moment at the cenotaph. Everyone had the chance to just have a personal moment there, because you don't get that any other chance normally. And I think the coppers at Downing Street could see what we were doing. So when we then went to Downing Street and did the same thing there, they went, fair enough. And when we left, they very kindly took the wreaths that we left there and put them on the cenotaph, because they could see that was going on. Now, the Ministry of Defence Police didn't have that pleasure. But when I've ever had to deal, I've covered lots of protests. I've been in riots. I've not rioted, obviously, but I've been around, like you have, plenty of armed police at times, and they know damn well you don't put your finger on the trigger. You don't hold it across your body right in front of people when you're talking to them. You know how you de-escalate situations and how you escalate them, entirely different. And this was badly handled policing, I think, to be fair. It was a very bad look for the Ministry of Defence, especially considering that it's the Ministry of Defence which has been covering up and lying to these veterans for 70 years. Steve says you don't see armed police at the eco protest blocking roads. Veterans are a bit more of an easy target. You get police turning up, but they're not armed in quite the same way, Steve. You're quite right. And they do generally try to negotiate with the eco protesters blocking the M25. But you got 4 men in their 80s and 90s tootling along and wishing to lay a wreath, which is supposed to be fairly sacred, to the war dead, the Cold War dead. And they're made to feel very unwelcome. It's not a good look at Remembrance Week. Mike says, could those heavy-handed tactics have been caused by requests from inside the MOD offices? I did very much get the impression that someone had made a phone call, Mike, but that's just an assumption. I don't know. Probably more like that the security guard in the lobby went, oh my God, someone's turned up and made a call to somebody. We'll have to see how things turn out, don't we, in the rest of the week. Now, it's obviously Armistice Day on Friday. The veterans will be marching at the cenotaph, wearing their missing medal badges on Sunday. And if you would like your own, if you are a nuclear test veteran, you don't have one, or a member of the family, or if you would like to support the nuclear veterans, you can go to the LABRATS.international webpage. I think that they're probably watching this, and there'll be a link going in the comments. They have a shop where you can buy your own, and it also contributes to the cause and helps them keep on campaigning and fighting. So if you like one of these badges, it's an absolute honor to be invited to wear one myself. Then, go ahead and see if you can have your own. There will be further revelations to come on the test veterans later this week. But PMQs today, like I said, there should be some MPs wearing these, and that's why. It's because their support for the missing medal that the nuclear test veterans deserve. Now, get into the questions. Ask us your comments. How do you feel about Gav finally being gone? Do you think Suella Braverman is going to be next? Do you think Rishi Sunak is going to last past Christmas? He's going to last longer than a lettuce, but I don't know what's like. Is he going to last as long as the Christmas turkey? We'll have to see, won't we? And we'll try and wrap some of those at the end. But first off, there is some good news in the world, and we managed to dig it out for you. Here it is. Now, you remember a few weeks ago, October the 12th, in fact, the NHS put out an amber alert because it was running low on blood. They had only 2 days supply for the entire country when normally they need 6. So planned operations were cancelled and it was all looking a bit sticky. Well, the great British public stepped up, and last Monday, the Blood Transfusion Service says they saw the biggest uptick in new donors in 20 years. 7,500 people signed up in a single day. The alert has been lifted. The blood is flowing like wine. Fabulous. Ben, is this proof that Britain has got a massive heart and it beats within its people?
Yeah, it's great news, isn't it? That when the backhaul went out, basically, that people did go to the blood banks and the temporary vehicles that turn up at your workplaces, so you can give a pint. So it's very good news that people did recognise the urgency and of the situation and wanted to do their bit, because it is, we don't, like some countries, don't pay people to donate blood. You do it out of the goodness of your heart. So it is great that people have seen that and wanted to do their bit. It does, for me, it brings back like how people were with their neighbours during the pandemic, and we're going shopping. Is there anything you need picking up? That sort of, I'm loath to use the phrase big society that David Cameron obviously got elected on back in 2010. But it is people showing the greater good and doing something that, remember, giving blood is a little bit of an insurance policy as well, because you might be the one who gets run over by the bus and needs 12 pints of blood. So you do it not just as well because you want to help your fellow man, but you do it because it could be you one day that needs that blood. So you do bear that in mind. You don't want the blood stocks to be low if you're the one requiring the transfusion.
Exactly. And it's, the entire theory of taxation, the NHS, everything you pay in to help everybody else, but it helps you too, is supposed to be the point. So long as they spend all this stuff wisely and they use it well. But, blood does all go in good people. So that's not a bad thing at all. So one question we've got to wrap on. Eileen says, have we ever had a government where so many have been sacked and where so many politicians have been guilty of sleazy and bullying acts? The government we've got is very, very new. So far we've got one who's sacked for allegations. But of course, I think Eileen's talking about the governments we've had since 2010, 2015, when Cameron got elected alone as opposed to part of a coalition. There has been, especially in the last couple of years, since 2019 and Boris Johnson, Ben, there's been a never-ending whack in the face with a wet fish. Someone else has gone. Someone else has gone. Is this why is that? Is this because the people who are in these type of governments, because of their ideology, or there's something about them, or because they're on the fringes of their party, they're just less experienced, or they're less good, or they're less nice? Is it because they're not as centrist and they're not as, I don't know, not as reasonable?
I think there's several reasons. One is that, and I was talking to someone about this a couple of days ago, that because the Conservatives ended up getting a much bigger majority than they thought they would, they hadn't vetted strictly some of the MPs who ended up getting elected. So they hadn't been through the very, very tough procedures that you would if you were going to, for example, win a safe seat in Surrey, for example. So there's that. There's also fish rots from the head. So if Boris Johnson's the Prime Minister, the leader of the party, and multiple sleaze allegations against him, multiple extramarital affairs, failure to declare outside earnings in time in Parliament, and scant regard for the rules that we saw around the pandemic. But if people think that's how the leader behaves, so they'll think, well, that's fine, I can do that as well. And then there's another element, which is perhaps one we should welcome, which is people won't put up with this nonsense anymore. You could, maybe it's we've all become too thin-skinned, some might argue, but the tolerance level for people sending abusive messages like Gavin Williamson did to the Chief Whip, well, back in 20 years ago, people might just have taken that. Now people won't accept that anymore. The workplace, people have certain standards that they think they can expect in a workplace, and they don't put up with that sort of nonsense. So that's something to be welcomed, because people realise their tolerance for it has run dry. So there are processes where you can raise these. I mean, obviously, there's Her Majesty's Press, where we welcome anyone giving us such allegations. But there are, within Parliament, there are complaints processes which didn't exist a few years ago, where they can be raised and dealt with largely behind the scenes, at least until the outcome of an investigation. So I think those three elements have all combined for this reputation of this Parliament, this former Prime Minister and Boris Johnson, and the fact that people just don't put up with this sort of stuff anymore.
No, well, I do wonder a little bit it is good, I think, that you've got some people, obviously officials and so on, who know there's someone they can go to complain to, as Priti Patel experienced, as Gavin Williamson experienced. But, Anne Milton, who came out with this Czech story, she's left Parliament. And she didn't mention it at the time. And she's an experienced woman of the world, and she's fairly tough. There's no reason that she couldn't have raised that with somebody. And I just worry whether there are still people probably deep within many organisations, many walks of life, who go, well, I know I could and I know I should, but I don't think I can. So the interview Anne Milton gave to Channel 4 last night, which basically did for Gavin Williamson in the end, these things that she's referring to happened 6 years ago. She could have spoken up at the time. Maybe she did internally, and like a good deputy chief whip, kept her mouth shut at the time. But we don't know that. I don't believe she was asked whether did you speak up about this at the time. And the fact remains that Gavin Williamson did remain in post whilst all this was going on. So we have to assume that either she didn't speak up, or if she did, nobody wanted to know, or thought, well, just get on with it. Yeah, and served under 4 prime ministers since then. So, there's cleaning the orgy in stables, and then there's the person in charge of the stables not really caring that it's a bit of a mess underneath anyway. Oh, dear. We'll have to see, won't we, how long Suella Braverman's going to last, how long Rishi Sunak lasts, whether this actually all does get tidied up, and whether we do get a missing medal in time for the national commemoration of the Plutonium Jubilee on November the 21st, which we will be carrying on these channels. Now, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Ben, for taking us through some of this. We're going to have to wrap up now because he's got to go and catch a train. He has to go to that thing called work. But we'll join you again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. If you're listening to us on a podcast, please leave us a review. And I believe Prime Minister's questions will be carried on these Facebook pages later on. So tune in then and see everybody wearing their missing medal badges and what kind of a beating Rishi Sunak takes. Bye, everybody. See you later. Thank you.